I'm not used to standing here, but I kind of like it. I'm not running for mayor or anything, but I would like to reconfigure my classroom over at Tech. I'm thinking this might be a good way to go, at least worth trying out. I'm not guessing it's going to work, however. Okay, this is a short story to get started. Sometime earlier in the semester, I told my students, I walked in and I looked really troubled about the way they were behaving. And I said that if this were going to be a proper Japanese class, why, as I walked in the classroom, they should all rise in unison, bow, and say, "Konnichiwa, sensei." They have yet to comply. So I may get the same results with my wish to reconfigure the classroom. I don't know. When Hugh Campbell, when you first raised this with me, we talked about what I might talk about, and for some reason he thought it might be something about early Virginia Tech. And that kind of stuck. Now, I didn't set out in life to write the history of Tech. I didn't even begin to. Hey, I've got this thing here. I don't have to stay anchored. Can you hear me just as well? We're going to check it out so I can hear me.
That's the recording you want.
Oh, that's what it's doing. The secret now comes out. So I am tethered. Okay, I'll stay put. I'll stay put. It was largely an accident, and I tell the story in this, what I call the Little Orange book from 10 years ago this fall. And I tell the story, and I'm not going to repeat it now, as to how I came to write that book. But it was a madhouse caper affair. 6 months from the time I broke it open to the time I was holding the printed copy. You can't do that with a book, and no sane person should try. I do not recommend this. Do not try this at home or anywhere else. But I worked with Mary Holloman at Pocahontas Press, and we were able to make the thing happen in a hurry. And I still like it a lot. And now when I need to know something about the early history of Virginia Tech, I go back to what I knew when I knew it to see what I said when I said it. And if it was right the first time, then maybe it's still true. Though I'm a little skeptical that it's as easy as that, and for reasons that will become clear as I talk for a few minutes. This accidental book led to this accidental book, which I did not mean to write either, but it happened. Shirley Strother apologizes for not being here. I wanted her to be here, but she had some cockamamie excuse about flying off to Scotland in the morning. So it's not true that she's standing out front with a picket sign and saying, "Please don't go in here," but she's not here, and I'm regretful about that. Working as I did on the history of Tech led me to all kinds of other things in the history of higher education. Again, this was unintentional, and I wound up to go to every southern state. So I've been to Oklahoma State, I've been to Texas A&M, and Auburn, and wherever it is you want to go, or don't. I've been there and foraged for good material for the book that'll be out in another month or so. But that meant too that when I wrote the history of Virginia, for some reason, I can't fathom it, perhaps you can help me guess, the history of higher education became a really central theme in that book. It was one of the things that I highlight. So let's talk about Tech's first half century. First, I have to confess I lied, or at least I bought as much wiggle room as I could. When we talked about the half century, that'd be 1872 plus 50, right? I said 70s to 20s. 1870s to 1920s. That left me a little space to play, and it's really critical that I have those additional couple years at least, because so much happened in 1924. But, well, before I do that, this is a story that comes, my wife's not here tonight, she's out there with that boycott sign, but I asked her, this is true, and I shouldn't say this, especially since it's being recorded, but I'll say it anyway. I think she loves me enough that I might get by. I asked her one day while I was writing the book, I said, what's a land-grant school? It's a fair question to ask of anybody who studies or teaches or does anything else on the Virginia Tech campus, and she gave me a pretty good answer. I really liked it. I didn't think any of it was true, but I thought it was a marvelous indication of what might be conventionally understood as its origin. So I'm going to read you just a little bit of this and then put it aside. Many people, this is one person at least, even at Virginia Tech, faculty, staff, and students, wonder from time to time what it means that the school is a land-grant institution. One typical notion appears to be that long ago, the state of Virginia owned some land in Blacksburg. The state granted the land to a school, and a university emerged on that land. You know, if there hadn't been a drill field there never would have been a school built around it. That notion is wrong, I write, on 3 counts. 1, the land was granted by the federal government to the state of Virginia, not from the state to the college. 2, the land that fostered the growth of a school came in the form of land scrip, paper. More valuable perhaps than this, not a lot, but some, representing a certain acreage to be sold and then converted into an endowment. So it supplied an annuity, not a location. And 3, by the 1850s and 60s, most public land, whether state or federal, federal for sure, state was gone, was west of the Mississippi River. Now, I won't go ahead and talk about that in more detail, but I always had this notion of a student skipping quickly from class to class, going from Nebraska to North Dakota, to get from one piece of the campus to another. So, something about the origins of the land grant system, an act passed during the Civil War, 1862. Virginia was otherwise occupied at the time and not perceived as a legitimate contender for such an investment. So it took another 10 years, 1872, before it, like its counterparts across the other former Confederate states, to get established in some fashion. All right, that's easy. Now, there's also the notion, of course, that there's only one land grant school, but black Virginians certainly know otherwise, that there's 2. There's always been 2. There's never been any other number but 2, except for 0. The very same act of the legislature that established that there would be money coming out of the Morrill Land Grant College Fund to come to Blacksburg, or near Blacksburg. It was right next door, but it was outside town. 1/3 of that would go to a new black school established in Tidewater called Hampton. And the schools were very similar at the time, except for one thing, that Hampton was already up and running, and Virginia Agricultural and Mechanical College, as it was about to be called, was not. Virginia Tech, map back in time. Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. You know that thing that requires 3 envelopes to get the whole letterhead? And the name before that was Virginia Polytechnic Institute. That's easy to get your head around. Before that, it was Virginia Agricultural Mechanical College and Polytechnic Institute. And before that, it was Virginia Agricultural Mechanical College. If we turn it around, and Stephen Ambrose always said, abandon chronology at your peril. So if we start at the beginning, and then it was Virginia Agricultural Mechanical College, then it added and Polytechnic Institute, then it trimmed the original name, then it added a new name, and it so far hasn't trimmed the original name, so it's still Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. Well, it was built upon a school that already did, in fact, exist, right? The Preston and Olin Institute had been in operation since the early 1850s. So now I tell you a true story, or at least it could be true. When I published this book in 1997, the occasion was the 125th anniversary of Virginia whatever, I had in mind, maybe not immediately, but soon, that I would bring out a revised edition 7 years later celebrating the 150th anniversary. All right? So the new subtitle would say 1854 to 2004. Now, as it turns out, I brought a different book out in 2004 from which I cribbed a lot of the good stuff that was originally in this book. But nonetheless, I never did write that book. I never will. I don't think it's going to happen. But that was my idea. Now, why would I do this? Creation myths are very important for institutions. And not all schools start with where the institution itself began, but rather build upon a predecessor institution. So why shouldn't we track it back to a white boys Methodist academy that originated in the 1850s, where the classes began in 51, or the charter came in 54. That's a good mark. I like that. It gave me 3 extra years, by the way, so I didn't have to rush into print that second edition that never is going to come along. Okay. Well, Longwood University didn't start out with that name. And its predecessor institution, a Methodist Girls Academy, a white Methodist Girls Academy, preceded by about a half century, the 1880s back to the 1830s. They chart their origins from that predecessor school, University of Tennessee. Jim, is that right? Does about the same thing, right? 1790s, don't wait to the 1870s. So we could do that thing. I believe in being a bit seditious when I write, and certainly I believe it when I talk. And if I didn't believe it, I'd be in trouble because I can't help myself. It happens. So if we want to talk about Virginia Tech's first 50 years, we might not want to wait to the 1870s to get started, and that would crimp my style enormously, of course, because if we started in 1851, I could only go to 1901, I'd have to quit. But I'm not going to quit. I'm just going to raise that as another possible way of looking at Tech's past. There are actually other connections. Lucy Lee Lancaster, if I remember right, reading something she wrote, and this would be about 10 years ago, and a lot of things I don't remember that long. She said about her father, I believe, that he attended Preston and Olin. Which, and if it's true, if I remember that, if it was true that she said it, if it's true that it happened, you know, multiple ifs, why the connections become even nicer. It's really hard to track the beginnings of Tech in 1872. Now, the people who've written about this in great detail don't include me. They include Lyle Kinnear and Harry Temple. They wrote the massive versions of the past, but they had to construct it on the basis of a really thin paper trail. There really isn't a lot of documentation about Tech from the years before about 1900. Partly that reflects, as Warren Strother said in his preface to Lyle Kinnear's book, that people were too busy doing things to write anything down. More than that, there'd been a catastrophic fire. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing when administration papers go up, but it really does hamper the good efforts of a historian to reconstruct the past on the basis of something more than imagination. So they wrote in great detail based on what they could find. And as it turns out, you look at that monumental book that Harry Temple turned out for Volume 1. Well, you know, the final volume he turned out covered only the 4 years he was a cadet at Tech. That first volume takes you all the way from 1872 to the turn of the century. It tells you something about the relative availability of materials to work with to tell that story. I want to talk a little bit about a halfway point. 1890s, halfway between whenever we start this story, but let's say the 1870s, because that's what I advertised. It was a Methodist academy. Something changed along the way, and when John McLaren McBride became president, somewhere in there people started talking about VPI when the new name came as Virginia Presbyterian Institute. Well, for whatever it's worth, under McBride's administration, enormous changes took place, and what had been a truly rickety little institution of very modest means and very modest enrollment and very modest aspirations, let alone accomplishments, though it had survived, and that was a major accomplishment, and we should say that much. When he came along, he came from the University of South Carolina, and he said, you know, I think we can do better. I think we can do more. So he set out to do more and better. And among the things, the campus culture of the 21st century, if you go back to the 1890s, you find the very first edition in 1895 of the student yearbook, The Bugle. You find in the 1890s the very first iteration of a football club and a tennis club. You find the beginnings of, undergraduates always want to say ut possum, beginning, they never took Latin, neither did I, but I do believe that it's ut possum, and that I may serve, or however it's translated, has something fundamental to do with an orientation toward an external community that I may serve, a wider world. That originated in 1896. Now again, we don't know very much about that. I received a request. How shall I say this? I received a request recently from someone in administration who clearly in the run-up to the beginnings of VT Engage next week wanted to know something about the origins of that phrase. So, of course, I looked in Kinnear. I told my students we had a real issue they should go out and address, and they poked around and they looked at Temple, and they looked in yearbooks from the 1890s, and they did what they were supposed to do, and they reported back that they couldn't tell me much more than I already knew, that I'd already cribbed from Kinnear and put in my little orange book 10 years ago. So we don't know a whole lot about that, but we certainly know that all of these changes are coming at once, and here are bigger ones. Well, is there a bigger one than football? Maybe not, but if there is, it might be graduate programs. In the 1890s, you get the beginnings of graduate study and the real possibility to stay on at Tech after you get a bachelor's. No students, when they graduate, never want to leave. Or come from some other place to get a master's degree. These are the kinds of things now that could happen. And in 1896, reflecting the new curriculum, the new thrust of the place, the name of the school changed, and that's where in 1896 the new term and Polytechnic Institute was added to the old name. If it was good before, it's too good to throw away, but we should add something to it to reflect the changing nature of the school, right? Well, that gets into my next point. I want to talk a bit about if you hear anybody say anything about tech, and everything they say could be true. One of them is that as a land-grant school, there has always been a tripartite mission, right? Teaching, research, service. Now, it needn't be a land-grant school. Truth be known, if you go to Tuscaloosa, Alabama, you find emblazoned on the brick wall on the outside of that campus those very three terms. And yet Auburn, not University of Alabama, is in fact the land-grant school, the white land-grant school, the historically white land-grant school in Alabama. So this may come, and I think it does, more as a result of its being a public institution. But there's no question that the ethos of the place very clearly talks about service. And yet, let's go back to 1872 if that's our point of origin. Now at least I've raised the question as to whether it is. The only of the three missions that can be associated with the beginnings of tech in 1872 would be teaching. An undergraduate school, not a research institution, not with an ethos about outreach, service, serving a wider community. But you can find those new missions coming in very soon after. Within a decade and a half, the Hatch Act, passed in 1887, bringing experimental stations, bringing the notion of research, bringing the notion of not only people who come to tech as students should benefit, but the whole wide community out there. That clearly gets launched as early as 87. So in fact, research is already a part of the place, an integral part of the place, when McBride comes along just a few years later and begins a formal graduate program, at least its beginnings. And by the time you get to the 19-teens, we haven't run out of time, we're not in the 20s yet, right? By the time you get to the teens, you get major new legislation coming out of Congress that greatly enhances this notion, this dual notion of research and outreach. So by the time we get to the 20s, the school is beginning again in so many ways to look much more like the one we would recognize today. What else shall I tell you about? Oh yes. You know, it's an all-white, all-male, all-military school, right? That's how it started. And that's pretty much true. The all-military actually is something of a question mark, even at the beginnings. Certainly for the first couple of decades, there was a lot of uncertainty as to just what the central structure and operation and constituency and mission and curriculum and all the rest, how students should be organized, what they should learn, what they should do in their spare time, whether they should have any spare time. But there's no question, it's a military school. It long was, to some extent it remains. For the past generation or two, there's been this jockeying, often pleasant and not always recognized, but jockeying for proprietary claim on a campus as to whether it's really military or really civilian. And the cadets are vastly outnumbered these days, and they know it. But that doesn't diminish in any way their claim on the place. They know that historically it's their school, and these other people can come too, I suppose. Well, the changing nature of the school as to how military, how central that is, that comes into play very clearly in 1924, when the second of Tech's three great presidents, Julian Ashby Burris, who had graduated from the school back in the 90s and now came back as president, he decided in 1924, for all kinds of reasons, the board, the institution generally, came to the conclusion that juniors and seniors, male juniors and seniors, should no longer be required to be in the Corps of Cadets. Well, but 3 years before that, and here I have a handout for you. It's the only thing I'm going to give you, okay? Everything else you have to pay for. Now, there are lots more copies here than there are of you. So either you can claim 2 or 3 and keep them as your own, or mail them off to friends, or take them home if you have a parakeet. Whatever it is you find you'd like to do with the extras. Let's talk about the all-male school and how it began to change. Now, I had a graduate student finish a thesis a year or so ago that looks much more closely than anybody ever had before at the change when it comes. But trying to get a grip on how a school, historically male, becomes something other than that is reflected, I think, in this picture. I stole it fair and square from a book I can no longer use or even find. The floppy disks that I used in '97, they're not user-friendly anymore. It's hard to find a machine you can read them. So I stole this from somebody else. They stole it from the same place I stole it from. And you can get it from special collections, except right now, if you go on the website, what you get is a big question mark, which wasn't exactly going to show you what I wanted you to see. Here we have the great iconic image of first 5 women at Virginia Tech. And it's very important to look at them. These are not cadets. These are not male students. They are graduates of Virginia Polytechnic Institute as of 1925. Now the easy version is this, that this quintet was the entire roster of students, female students, to take classes at Tech. There was none before them. They all came together. They all graduated together. This is the crew. But as with the version of what's a land-grant school, that's not necessarily so. Mary Brumfield, pictured at left, had come as a junior, so graduated right on schedule, something that Tech students don't always do. You know, the T-shirt, best 4 or 5 or 6 years of your life. She finished right on schedule in 1923. She is, without a doubt, the first female graduate of Virginia Polytechnic Institute. But she stayed on. Even then they couldn't go away. She stayed on, and she got her master's. And she's in this picture because that very year, 1925, she was picking up an MS to add to her BS. And standing beside her proudly, full graduation regalia, or our 4 other female students getting degrees this year. Now, let's read the caption. Although most of Tech's cadets did not approve of the invasion, and that's probably a pretty fair characterization, 12 women students were admitted to Tech for the first time in September 1921. Now, we could carp about the language there, but the point is that there were more students than just these 5. There were some part-timers. Evidence is pretty clear that at least for summer programs, there had been women before. They were authorized expressly during the teens. But now they come in during the regular session as degree candidates. 5 of them full-time, 7 part-time. Live at home, live in town, walk to school. In '25, she received an MS degree along with the first 4 women graduates to complete a 4-year BS degree from VPI. That can't possibly be true. 3 of them, that's true. That is, that they were finishing a 4-year degree and had done it all at Tech, but the other one, not possibly. What we see here is Ruth Tourette. That's true of her. Lucy Lee Lancaster, many of you knew her. She never left either. She didn't leave school. She didn't leave the town, right? She lived forever. And she lived it out here and worked at Tech in the library where she started as an undergraduate during those very years. But then we get to Louise Jacobs. Now, she is not one of the original 5, the original 12. She had transferred in as a junior in 1923, the same year that Mary Brumfield got her master's, and the same year that Billy Kent Cabbage left for what used to, as late as the 1960s, be called the MRS degree. So she married, she left school, but the numbers remained constant because in her place as a junior came in this new student as a transfer, and she graduates right on schedule. The caption is misleading, but it captures the mythology. It captures, it's a nice iconographic image. These 5, they're the only female students. They were the very first ever to step foot on campus. They started in 1921. They finished in 1925. They all got bachelor's degrees that year, and here they are. Well, we can't talk with them anymore, but 2 or 3 of them lived well into the time that I was teaching at Tech. I once had a student write about a relative who got her degree at Tech in 1923. She knew her. Now look at the bottom. This is a campus that has admitted, grudgingly perhaps, but fully admitted as degree candidates, women as full-time students who then earn degrees and do everything you would expect students to do except for, well, they can't live on campus. They won't be included in the yearbook, the Bugle, so they created an alternative, the Tin Horn, and they're depicted here. 4 issues Whether there were more, I'm unsure, but 4 at least survive and are in special collections. In fact, they're digitized, and you can sit at your house and look on the computer and leaf through the pages any old time. How about to the left? Until the 30s, student dramatic productions featured all male casts. Well, I take exception to that because the women thespians had all female casts, some of whom played male roles. The male students, whether civilian or military by that point, played all the roles, male and female. So this is a gendered language approach to a gendered situation, and you can't see around that corner. Which do you suppose this is? Photographs are very important. So are these the males playing male and female roles, or the females playing male and female roles? Given the language, we understand the perception was that these are males playing both roles, but they're the only real students after all, because women wouldn't be permitted to play these roles, except of course they do, but in their parallel universe that includes both the Tin Horn and their own thespian society, their own basketball club, their own almost everything. And they took great pride in this parallel universe. They had been evicted in part, admitted in part, and they made their peace with the place and did most elegant work at it. Now, about male juniors and seniors who get opt during the time, the very time that those 5 students were taking classes at Tech before 1925, a year before, President Burris says, well, we're going to change something else too. Junior and senior, but now I have to say male juniors and seniors no longer have to be in the Corps. They can opt out if they want. Now, that meant that for the first time there would be 3 cohorts on campus at any given time. Now, they might be radically different in size, but there would be civilian males, cadet males, and civilian females. But I lie. There were already civilian males on campus before 1924. How'd that happen? Well, if you were admitted and were physically decrepit in some fashion, the way that I aspire to be, but not anytime soon, mostly the great exception was for people who had gone off and fought World War I. They had done the real thing, and it was not required of them when they came back that they do this thing in the Corps. Now, the Corps of Cadets advertises a number of Congressional Medal of Honor winners that includes one who had gone to World War I and finished the war before he was ever in the Corps, so it's hard to see how the Corps produced that particular member. But, okay, again, the mythologies are out there, and they have some core truth to them, but as historical reality tends to be a little bit messier than those quick captions would suggest. Okay, now, how many presidents has Virginia Tech had? And you can start with whoever lives in the Grove today and then ask who was the same person there 10 years ago and 20 years and 30, and you can reconstruct that list, right? And we know because we were told, we could read it in the paper, we heard it at his coronation. The current president is number? Anybody know? I have to look it up. I cheat. I was going to ask you because I'm hoping you would know. Here somewhere, I've got it. 14, I think. But it's coming, and if I can't find it there, I'll find it here. So here we have a list of presidents. Paul Torgerson was number 14. Jim McComas, 13. And map on back. Now, in order for the current number to be true, all the previous numbers have to be true, but they're not. In multiple ways, they're not. The mythology of Tech's past. I mean, it's neat to get a list, but then again, what do you do about James Lee Buchanan, who served twice? Should we treat him like Grover Cleveland and assign him 2 numbers? Or what about this fellow Ship who comes down from VMI, takes the job, comes down, sets up shop, spends a couple weeks on campus, it seems, then decides this is really not what he bargained for, so he heads up to VMI and spends the rest of his career there and is so shaken by his experience, he changes the spelling of his name. It's no longer Ship with 1 P, it's now Ship with 2. Or the faculty member who during this interregnum, when there was a tremendous amount of instability, served for an entire year as an acting president. Should we include him too? So what I said at the bottom of this, I like tables at the back of books, you know, appendices. Turns out medical people have found that appendixes serve for some real purpose, but in books they do too. John Lee Buchanan served as president for 3 months in 1880, 5 months in 1881-82. Between those two periods, Scott Shipp spent a few days on campus in August 1880 after briefly accepting the presidency, and Professor John Hart served as acting president in 1880-81. He served longer than either of the other two, both of them put together, the time he was there, the time before, and the time after. But we don't count them. If we do, then suddenly we're going to skip ahead, and number 15 is not 15 at all, but 16 or 17 or 18? My book has a picture of every tech president, or at least it might, but it doesn't, because one, I excommunicated. We borrowed him from UVA, we shipped him back, not much improved. I discovered that he was enough of a white supremacy leader in the 1920s and 30s, though his reputation had been sanitized somewhat by the time he died in the 40s, that I wasn't going to put him in my book. And I masked that by the way I situated presidents, but I did not give him a space. But I didn't give a space either to these unnumbered people that we just didn't talk about. There's a great picture, and I've got it here, but I didn't run it off for you. It's in my book, the little one you can't buy because it's not in print, but there they are. All the presidents of Virginia Agricultural Mechanical College, every last one of them. Well, we have Minor, Buchanan, just once. We didn't get two pictures of him. McBride, it was actually VAMC before he came along, changed its name, right? And Lomax, and Conrad. But what about Shipp? What about, okay. But they're all in there. Now, if you stride across Virginia Tech's campus, which is not very far away, you could do that. You should stop by sometime. You can look for buildings named after Tech presidents, and you can find Torgerson, McComas. You have to go after Vet Med to get Lavery, but there's a chunk of that that's his. Hahn, he ought to have the new science building, but he gets the old one. I think he should, but every president back through Burris to McBride, and then history ends when you go backwards. You cannot find, no matter how many you count, no matter how many names you list, not a solitary person before McBride has a building named after him. He doesn't exist, nor does he, nor do they, or they, none of them. So lost in the misty origins of Virginia Tech's early history are all those people. And they didn't make my pantheon of top 3 presidents. They didn't make it like McBride did. They didn't make it like Burris did. And I have, who'd be the other one? I have 3 in mind. But they are absolutely critical. Without them, after all, there would be no McBride, no Burris, no Hahn. So we might want to know more about them. And we really can. And I'm not going to repeat the story. Well, I could if really pressed, but it's in the book about the extraordinary turbulence at Tech, where the legislature kept changing as to who was in control of it, and they determined who would be on the board, and the board determined, or somebody did, and the faculty all get turned loose, and then somebody gets hired back, and a new president. That's centrally to do with why you had that extraordinary turnover in 1880, 81, 82, because this was a state institution subject to the whims of the legislature. Of course, the legislature never has whims. Let's talk about those 3 great presidents. McBride. We've already talked a bit. Transforms the campus iconography, the campus culture, the nature of the place in so many ways, whether it's football or graduate programs. Now you want to know, did a graduate student play football? I don't know. Burris, when he came along, I got at some really big ticket items early in his presidency about how the place begins to change in very significant ways. Not a lot. Right? I mean, 5 full-time female students is not a lot, but they're there. 1 is the breakthrough number. If I'm going to finish in the 1920s, or today, then I can't talk about the absolute physical transformation of the campus in the 1930s, when everything from, well, Burris Hall, make your way around the drill field, building after building is a monument to the New Deal. Monument to the Great Depression, the response to the Great Depression, all that massive new construction that went up. Big ticket items at a time of absolute fiscal catastrophe. Well, not exactly. Counterintuitive, but there it is. Burris transformed the place, and these are some of the ways. How about Marshall Hahn? Just quickly. Building on the changes of McBride in the 1890s and of Burris in the 1920s, he took the place to a whole new galaxy. For the first time, female students admitted without restriction. Now, until enough housing was on stream, so it was a late 1960s, there really wasn't going to be a huge influx of female students. But the policy change came in 1964. The very same year as male freshmen and sophomores no longer had to be in the Corps. Monumental changes, and then a whole new spate of construction that just transforms the physical face of the place and extends the campus out radically from the central, from where it began, right? That one solitary little building that was inherited from Preston and Owen, and then she got married and changed her name as Owen and Preston. Right up here, think Henderson, think Lane, but don't think Lane too much because you'll put it too far away and you'll get the wrong building. But somewhere in there, one building. Okay? Marshall Hahn comes in, he builds on the, well, let's talk about graduate programs, let's talk about research. This is going to be an absolutely central part of the school. Way off from where it began in the 1890s. Football, let's not forget about that. Whatever Marshall Hahn's wishes about campus climate and football, he came around quickly to recognize that the visibility of the place would be a very large part of function of how visible its athletic programs were. And so in some respects, Beamer ball dates back to Marshall Hahn. And in fact, it does in terms, let's go ask when Beamer ball was being played by Mr. Beamer, when he was young Mr. Beamer. The Corps, oh, there's one last thing. That all white, remember that? If you look in old yearbooks, and if you look in old student directories, you find by the time that McBride is president, let alone by the time Burris is, students from China. Now they have strangely gringo names. They're clearly the sons of missionaries and diplomats and businessmen and the like, but they come from China. Well, by the 1920s, on Burris's watch, we find Chinese students who are ethnic Chinese coming from China. Cato Lee's my #1 exhibit. He's not my only, but he comes in 1923. Did we mention 23 before? All this is happening at once. He graduates in 27, a degree in mechanical engineering. By the way, he lived on campus. He was an integral part of the athletic program. He took any classes he wanted. He was no way restricted. Marshall Hahn's watch, for the first time, black students could be admitted without restriction. So black men, black women, white women, all without restriction, without curricular restriction of any sort by the late 1960s. It wasn't true that the first black student didn't come into 1964, 62, 64, 66. It is true that, as far as we know, the first black student coming as a degree candidate was admitted in 1953. And he could come only as an engineering student under segregated access because he couldn't take those programs at Virginia State, the other land-grant school, because it had no engineering curriculum. He couldn't live on campus. He couldn't be in the barracks, except he had to be when he came out to formation. These three presidents transformed the place. But you can see that, huge as I think what Marshall Hahn did, he really is building in material ways easily identifiable on what Burris did in the 1920s, on what McBride did in the 1890s. By the time we get into the 1920s, not only did the school begin to look remarkably familiar in a host of ways, even if still strange in many others, but it's laid the groundwork for the extraordinary change that will take place another several decades later. So I don't really know anything about the first few years of Virginia Tech. Nobody can. There's no documentation that you can pursue. But on the other hand, these kinds of things you can think about, and everything you thought you knew might be true. And then again, it's more complicated than any of us might have thought. Thanks.